Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're going to wait a few minutes. We've got a large pool of participants joining from all over the world. So let's give it another minute and we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you. Awesome. Yeah, if you want to put a note as to where you're joining us from, that'd be awesome. Hello from Bosnia and Herzegovina. And thank you. We have already a couple of hundred people that have joined. Thank you for joining us. We'll get started in a minute. But if you want to tell us where you're joining from, that'd be awesome. I see Poland and Portugal and France. Hello. Peru, Italy, India, Latvia, Argentina, Egypt. Wow. This is a big list and growing really fast. UK, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia. Thank you for joining us late in the evening or late at night. India, Latvia, Argentina, more from Peru, Philippines. Awesome. We got Greece and Russia. It's midnight. Thank you for joining us. Excellent. It seems like people are doing a really good job using the chat function. So please continue to do that. But let me go ahead and get started. We have about a couple hundred participants. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. As you can see, we have people from all over the world joining us. And no matter where you're joining from, wishing you a very warm welcome. Hoping you and your family and colleagues are safe and healthy. And thank you for giving us the next hour of your day. And today is the first webinar in our assessment summer camp. We have a really good webinar. It's a fireside chat titled How Teacher-Powered AI is Pushing the Boundaries of Progress in Teaching, Testing, and Beyond. It's a great way to start the summer session. My name is Nick Laul, and I'm the VP of Product Management for Pearson English Assessment, and I'm responsible for developing assessment solutions for English language learners around the world. I'm based in New Jersey on the East Coast of the US, and today I'm joined by my colleagues, Dr. Rose Clesham in London and Dr. Bill Bonk in Colorado. Rose is the Director of Academic Standards and Measurement and focuses on assessment standards and research. She holds a master's and doctorate in educational assessment, is a fellow of the Association for Educational Assessment, and an honorary fellow of the University College London. Bill is a second language measurement expert at Pearson and focuses on AI technology and innovation. He has a joint PhD in cognitive psychology and cognitive science and a master's degree in second language studies. It's my pleasure and honor to have them here today. I have learned a lot from both of them over the years, and it's exciting to host a conversation and discussion on AI in education and assessment. And I'm sure over the next 45 minutes, you will have an opportunity to ask lots of questions and learn a lot from them as well. So before we get started, let's do some quick housekeeping. So Rose and Bill will speak for about 7 to 10 minutes each. And most of the time today will be reserved for Q&A towards the end of our talk. Feel free to submit your questions in the chat box or in the Q&A section anytime during the talk. We'll try and get to them as many as possible. Certificates of attendance will be sent out in the days following the session. And obviously this webinar is also recorded, will be available shortly after the session. So do share it with your colleagues. So hopefully the next 10 or 15 minutes and the prepared remarks that Rose and Bill will share will really set the reference point for the conversation and allow for a great discussion and questions from our audience. Rose, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Okay, thanks a lot, Nick. If you can go to the next slide, Bill. Okay, so Nick gave you a very quick introduction. Welcome, everybody. I think just to very briefly describe, I think, where I'm coming from. My background was I started in teaching, and then I became more interested then in terms of my two favourite words, which are on the screen now, reliability and validity. And I've spent my whole professional career really either teaching in the classroom, trying to do both of those things, and working for governments and testing organisations, researching in these areas. And what I do now in a way is to try and keep an overview on how these really important elements are applied to any assessments that we offer people, whether it's formative or summative, and I'll talk about that in a second. So again, in a way, I just want to take us back a step or two before Bill goes into a bit more detail about how the technologies actually work. I think where I'm coming from in a way is to say to you, what we do in Pearson is that we use technology to support teachers and learners in assessment of any kind globally. And we want to explain to maybe some of you that may not have heard anything about this before, some of you may know a little bit about it. We're going to do quite an informal talk, and then we're happy to take any questions at all. No question is too easy or too hard for us. So, you know, sort of think about what you may want to ask us during this session. So my two favourite words. Validity is the most important thing. Okay, I'm sure many of you are teachers, as I was, and now I work in an assessment sort of company. But validity is everything, really. And in terms of assessment, the fundamental question that we all ask ourselves all the time is, does that assessment measure what we intended it to measure? Is it fit for purpose? And so my role and Bill's role is all about that. It's making sure that our assessments are fit for purpose, that they actually assess what they are intended to assess. Okay, so that, for example, if I was going to assess a skill, an actual physical skill, I would not want to assess that through a multiple choice question. I would want to make sure that I actually do assess that skill. And that comes in, that is a central part of how we assess our language skills in Pearson, where we are not just assessing one or two of those skills through technology and through AI, we assess all 4 skills. So that's a really important part of it, really. And of course, just as important then is to make sure that that assessment is fair. Okay, if you're a classroom teacher, you use assessments all the time and you make sure that your assessments are fair to everybody in your class. If you are setting national assessments, you have to make sure that those assessments are fair to the population as a whole. If you're setting global assessments, which is what we do, you have to make sure and do an awful lot of research and development to make sure that those assessments are fair, whoever takes them and wherever they do take them. Okay, so that is a sign of a responsible and robust testing organisation. Obviously, we want to make sure that the results that come through are a good measure of what the student can know and what they can do. And that sort of comes down in a way to the accuracy of the assessments, which again, we'll talk about during the session. And are the outcomes trusted? And in particular, you know, I think people forget that a large part of validity is, what do the test takers think? Do they trust us? Do they use us? What do test acceptors think? Do they accept us? Do they trust us? And again, we'll talk about that in this session. Reliability is a part of validity. It's not the whole thing, but it's a very important part. And really then it's about, well, how consistent would that measure be? And we have pretty impressive statistics to show that our technology fueled assessments are extremely reliable. So that if you take a test today, and if you take a test tomorrow, and if you take a test the day after, the likelihood is that you're going to get a very similar result. And often with non-technology assessments, that can vary, you know, sometimes worryingly, particularly in the harder skills of speaking and writing, where people sometimes have slightly different views of what the standard is and apply them sometimes differently. But the same person can apply it differently, and actually they can apply it differently across markers. And that's a measure of marking reliability, which is, again, something we'll talk about. Okay, next slide, Bill. Okay, so very quickly, you know, we use the term assessment all the time, but let's just be clear here that when we're talking about the use of technology here, we're talking about it in the space of formative assessment, which is obviously assessment for learning, and we're also applying it to summative assessments, which is assessment of learning. Okay, next slide. So formative assessments, as we know, they're things that are normally done in the classroom. They're about the interaction between the students and the teacher. They help teachers to to assess the effectiveness of their own teaching in their classes. And also the results of those formative sort of practices, they can adjust and adapt to what they do with students. And for learners, it makes them more active participants. And then they can be part of their own learning journey, and they can take responsibility for their own learning. And there was a time, maybe 20, 30 years ago, where people saw formative assessment as being only in the gift of the teacher themselves, whereas the use of technology can help teachers provide much more rich formative assessment strategies. Okay, next slide. And in summative assessment, where people think, I suppose, that most tested organisations, that's all they do, and that may be the case for some organisations, but in Pearson, because we are a learning and an assessment organisation, we put equal measure in both of those buckets, really. So assessment of learning normally takes place maybe at the end of a module or the end of a session or at the end of a qualification. It's normally a particular time in space where somebody wants to know, okay, I want a measurement of where the student is up to. And we all know that those key points are really important as staging points in a learning journey, and are used for selection purposes, are used for accountability purposes, and for learners, they become part of their currency. They will carry that measure with them forever. So it's really important that we do our job well, and we do it with accuracy, and we do it with fairness. Next slide. And so what we're talking about when we talk about technology and AI is the whole gamut here. That image on the left still gives me sort of, nervous moments, really. This idea that assessment has to take place in a really large hall, all at exactly the same time, at exactly the same place. Those things happen, but really technology is enabling us to move to the right of that diagram so that we can use it for individualized, personalized learning where people are progressing at their own rate. It can be used with teachers alongside students in and outside of the classroom. And then when we need summative assessments, we can have secure, highly reliable assessments done at a when ready basis. So people don't have to wait for a particular date for a particular time. They can book tests and they can take tests to suit their timings. Next slide. So, these are key measures, really, of why technology has so much to offer, to work not against teachers, quite the opposite, to work with teachers. That they help to address the real demands that teachers have now to integrate personalised learning pathways into every one of their learners. So every person is as important as everybody else, and you don't have to have a one-size-fits-all. They're really important because it's rather than just being able to assess one skill, we can assess all 4 skills. And that's hard. And if you go back to what I was saying about speaking and writing, they are the parts of language that are often the least reliable in assessment, because it's so hard to keep the standard the same across a class, across a country, and across the world. And yet technology, the use of technology, can make these assessments fair to everybody. Teacher workload, Bill will talk about in more depth in a minute. To make people better, if I want to be good at something, I know I need to practice. And we all know that the limiting factor here is teacher time. Teachers have 20 to 30 people in the class. They may have 7, 8, 10 classes. You cannot give the amount of individual attention that maybe those students want or require. Whereas once we use technologies, then students can be more autonomous, and they can get assessed as many times as they want, and which gives them that improvement pathway. And in the end, what we're doing here, it's not rocket science. What we're doing is getting the technology to do what technology does best, which allows teachers then the time to do what they do best. Okay, and we can use the data that's coming out of the technology to give quite rich diagnostic feedback to students and to teachers about where students are at and where they need to go. And so what you end up is with a very powerful blended learning tool, so that if you have really good teachers, they can use data, they can use the technology to support what they do. If we have a shortage of teachers, and obviously given where we've been for the last year, we can rely on sometimes these sort of automated technologies to replace sometimes educators that aren't there. Okay, next slide. I think we've lost Bill for a second. While we're waiting for Bill to get back, what my next slide was going to talk about was that, you know, sometimes we think that because we're the creators of the assessments and that we sort of, you know, we produce assessments, that we are the arbiters of what people want to do. But actually, like I said, in the end, students will actually go to where they want. When we've run large surveys, global surveys, we get really significant feedback from students saying that part of the reason why they choose our tests is actually because they are computer-based and AI. You know, again, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that wasn't an option. But students these days, that when we poll them, and we poll thousands of students every year, the main reasons they give for choosing our assessments are that they get really quick results, are the idea that they think that those tests are far more unbiased than human rating, is the idea that it is automatically scored by computer. So in the end, students and teachers vote with their feet. And so that's really encouraging for us, because it means that we know we're on the right track. Okay, and next slide, Bill, just to finish off. Okay, I'm going to pass over to Bill now, but what I would say is that this is a really great quote from Fei-Fei Li, who's a really good person to follow on Twitter. She's the chief scientist at Google, and she's a very leading figure in this area of communication, of the advantages of using technology and AI in society. And her main point that she tries to get across to people is that it's not about that AI has got nothing to do with humans. It's quite the opposite. There's nothing artificial about it. And our systems are built on using expert human raters and building our systems then to replicate the very best human raters, so that every single person, wherever they are, is treated as if they're being assessed by the very best language experts that we can find. So I'm going to pass you over to Bill now, who's going to go into a bit more detail about actually how the English systems actually work. And then we'll open it up to questions afterwards. Thanks.
Yeah, Rose, let me jump in. Bill's having computer issues, not surprisingly, and his computer crashed. So we have a couple of questions that I think might be a good place to kind of wait for Bill to join while we let's get to these couple of questions.
Yeah, sure, I think, yep.
The one question, which is a relevant thing that you hear from teachers all the time, is, you know, mixed ability classes. How do you deal with students that have different levels of English? How do you assess them equally? Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I was a teacher for a long time, and I think the theory and the practice of mixed ability is tricky, because on the one hand, you know, you don't want to sort of artificially separate people for social reasons, you know, on the basis of ability. You want people to have cross-pollination of different types of people in the same learning situation, but they are learning at different paces. They have different demands, they have different needs. And so the use of technology allows people that we can have all the advantages of mixed ability people being in the same space, and yet learning and progressing at the rate that is appropriate to them.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for that. Hey, Bill.
Hey, I'm here. Yes.
Okay, so we will transition to your slides, and there's some good questions coming in. So everyone, thank you for sending those in, and keep sending those our way. So Bill, over to you.
Okay, yeah, let's, and you've got the slides, Nick?
Yeah. So
okay, can you go to the next one, please? Hi, my name is Bill Bonk. I work in Boulder, Colorado, and I'm responsible for a lot of the research, psychometrics, and automated scoring systems that we use for a lot of our language tests in Pearson, in particular PTE Academic. But I'll talk in general about automated scoring as one kind of artificial intelligence. and talk about some of the reasons that we use it and some of the trade-offs that there are inherent in it. So if you can just hit another click, Nick. So if we want to think about in the days before there was automated scoring of performance assessment, not just multiple choice, checking a bubble sheet and seeing whether A, B, C, or D was correct. I mean, that's automated scoring, but it's not artificial intelligence, really. When we get into automated scoring, we're asking people to actually perform tasks using language and often doing it with a computer. And so there's a technology enhancement aspect to that item. And in many cases, we are not just appealing to humans to make judgments about those performances, because we can score it much more quickly and easily using some sort of automated scoring mechanism that includes components of language comprehension, of comparison, of incorporating scoring mechanisms that have been generated through a machine learning process. So before I begin talking about automated scoring in general, I'd like to talk about the alternative, which is non-automated scoring, or using human raters for performance assessment. And when I say performance assessment, again, I'm talking about when you ask people to actually do things. You're not just asking them to tick a box, but they might be writing a word or a whole sentence or a paragraph. They might be listening to a story and then telling it back in their own words. And we have to develop systems that can score those kinds of performances as well. On the left-hand side here under red and the positive sign, I've got some ideas about things that human raters are particularly good at. They're good at human linguistic skills because humans have developed language over the past several 100,000 years as probably the most specialized aspect of our intelligence of all of them. And we are the only animals that use such a sophisticated form of communication, although all animals use communication. Our intelligence our linguistic system is particularly tuned to language that comes in through our ears, sign language. We're particularly good at comprehending nuance. So all of these things of humor, irony, sarcasm, understanding are a part of our culture that goes along with language. People have immediate kind of reactions to responses. So they understand and have some kind of emotional or intellectual reaction that's well tuned. And it's something that we develop from the time that we're born. Indeed, even before we're born, we're beginning to be attuned to language. So all of these verbal and nonverbal skills are things that we develop over time as becoming extremely specialized. In addition to that, when you're using humans as raters, you're also able to ask them to do self-correction. So they might notice something and then they can go back and adjust it, and rather than just commit to some kind of score and then stick with it. And additionally, humans are very good at flexibility. We can give human raters new instructions, and then we can tell them, now you're going to do things in this way because we've noticed that you've been doing it a little bit too much in this other way. So humans can be flexible with instructions. So humans have a lot of advantages, and this is the way that performance assessment has been measured since the beginning of performance assessment for thousands of years, literally. There are also some trade-offs, though. On the right-hand side of my slide here, I give some ideas about some of the negative aspects of using humans, and they are not insignificant. They actually can be quite important. It takes a lot of time to train human raters in order to do these things. That training takes quite a bit of expense, so it's costly to do that. Humans can be particularly subjective in many ways. They can have biases that are implicit, that are invisible, that they don't even know about themselves or that you haven't picked up on. And only after a long amount of data would you be able to determine whether they have any kind of bias against particular gender, age, skin color, accents, etc. Humans are emotional as well as cognitive creatures. So we have nervousness, anxiety. It affects our performance. Humans also have a lot of what we would call cognitive biases, or things that affect the way that we do things, even when we're trained to do them in another way. So often we compare students to one another when they appear one after the other, even if they were randomly assigned and there was no reason to compare them to one another. Humans are not particularly good at judging absolute values. If you give someone a bottle and you say, how much does this weigh? They are not particularly good at doing that in an absolute way. It's only with comparison and contrast where human intelligence really emerges. And we're very good at some of those aspects. So asking people to make an absolute judgment is often fraught with errors. There are a lot of human factors not necessarily related to our emotions or our intellect, but just the fact that we are animals, and so we get bored, we get tired, we get hungry, we lack concentration in some cases. There are many aspects to training humans to act in certain ways that doesn't work out in the end. We can also be kind of unreliable. We don't turn up on time, or we kind of tune out at various moments. And also we can exhibit quite low reliability, both inter-rater reliability, which is comparing raters to one another. If any of you have instituted testing regimes, you would know that it's very difficult to get people to agree on ratings many times, especially when these are kind of slippery, invisible, intangible characteristics of performances that are not well captured in a scoring rubric. Intra-rater reliability is another form of reliability, which just tests the same person over and over again. And over time, we can drift. We can become more severe or more difficult in our judgments. And we have no knowledge of that drifting. So these are trade-offs in using humans and machines. Obviously, all of the things on the right here are things that machines don't tend to suffer from, but humans do. On the other hand, the things on the left are things that humans are particularly good at, but machines might not be. And machines are not very good at picking up on certain kinds of nuance, humor, sarcasm, etc. So this is not to say that one or the other is better. In fact, when we construct automated scoring mechanisms, we use some of these human intelligence aspect to train the machines to act like humans. So we use a lot of data in order to get them to imitate the best kinds of human raters, the raters that have been, where we have washed out the effects of bias, nervousness, unreliability, etc. So in a way, we're trying to achieve the best of both worlds when we implement an automated scoring system. In some cases, automated scoring systems might be really good. They might, and in some cases, they might be really poor. You can imagine Rose's example earlier of someone who was going to be asked to demonstrate a skill, perhaps, for example, driving. Using a human rater of a person in the car while you're giving a driving test probably makes the most sense, whereas an automated system might have some kind of unexpected performance. So there are cases in which making a human rater judgment being the final score actually makes a lot of sense. And there are other cases where it makes more sense to use automated scoring. So it's not that one is better than the other. It's just that there are trade-offs, and in different situations, you might decide that one is better than the other. Let's go to the next slide. So I'd like to talk a little bit about another aspect of using human raters. When we train an automated scoring system to give scores, we base it on human judgments. In some cases, another aspect of human judgments that can be quite variable is their interpretation of the scales, of the rubrics, or the scoring rubrics or descriptors that have been included and given to them. I'm showing the speaking band descriptors from the IELTS test, and as you can see, it's very, very complicated. I know you can't read all these words there on the screen. It would take a long, long time to train people to get to the point where they have internalized this rubric and not have to look at it at every moment when they're scoring. So that's one drawback to using a very complex system of scoring. Let's go to the next slide, and I'll show a somewhat simpler. Here's a somewhat simpler rubric, which humans can apprehend or learn more quickly and more easily. It has only one dimension, which is fluency and coherence, rather than those 5 that I showed in the previous slide. And it has simpler bullet points. So this one would be a little bit easier to train humans to work on. Let's go to the next slide. Here's one that we actually use in Pearson, which is only essentially a 4-point rubric or a 3-point one. There are 3 real scores, 0, 1, and 2, and we have very simple descriptors that people can quickly learn and quickly agree upon. And then the final one is obviously when it's not scoreable because there's not enough information there. So the rubrics can also contribute to the variability of human scoring. We try to get our rubrics as simple as we can make them, but not too simple because we want to really capture the important aspects of the performance. Let's go to the next slide. So in some, and click through the animations here. So let's think about there's one case in particular where automated scoring really makes a lot of sense here. We know that students need to write a lot in order to learn how to write better in a language like English. Even if it's their first language, people don't just automatically acquire that discourse. It takes a lot of practice, feedback, understanding what you've written and how that compares to a good or a poor example. So we know that frequent and timely feedback is a major driver of people learning how to write better. But the problem is that teachers have a very limited amount of time and energy to give feedback. I remember working at a university in Japan, and there was one particular teacher who had a stack of student papers about that big on his desk. And it was weeks and weeks and weeks of papers. So the students had written and they were just giving the papers, turning them in. And so they were fulfilling their part of the responsibility, but the teacher was not keeping up with the feedback. And so those papers were just stacking up. It was very demoralizing to the students. It certainly was not helpful to them in their writing learning. So that's a particularly bad example, but even teachers who are quite competent and trying to keep up can't possibly keep up with a student when you have, you might have 50 or 100 students all at the same time, and you'd like them to be writing every day. So that student learning is ultimately limited by the teacher factors of time and energy for giving feedback. So here's one case. Can we go to the next slide, Nick? Where it makes a lot of sense to have some kind of automated writing assessment system where the teachers are separated out from the feedback system so they can spend their time doing the things that they have more energy and more expertise in, and the automated system that has been trained to give good feedback can work with the students and they can get feedback immediately. They can write an essay immediately. Let's go to the next slide here. They can immediately get some kind of feedback on all of these aspects of their writing. If you can see this would be a teacher dashboard or a view of a number of students. And the students wrote a number of essays, and here you can see they got feedback on overall performance, ideas, organization, writing conventions, sentence fluency, word choice, all of these things that we can train an automated scoring system to do quickly within seconds. So the student writes an essay, gets feedback, and when they see a bunch of red marks there, they think, oh, that's not very good. I need to do work on organization. The system might even give you some directive feedback and help you to organize your essay better. And then within an hour, they can write a new essay, submit it again to the system and see if their score went up. And they can do this over and over again. And this kind of system really promotes this idea of students learning to write by writing, not by someone telling them what good writing looks like, but actually doing it, seeing their green, yellow, and red marks, and then doing it again and again and again and again. And so teachers get a high level view of where the students are strong, where they're weak, where he or she might need to put some energy or attention into the instruction, and therefore can personalize the learning for these students, as well as address the whole class. Let's go to the next slide. So this is a system called Right to Learn in Pearson, and there is some good research that showed, for example, that when a number of students in North Carolina, in one of the United States here in 2009, had they were kind of randomly separated into these two groups, the experimental group and the control group. So the 85 students had teachers that were using Right to Learn, and the control group were these 80 students where the teachers were not using Right to Learn. And so the students were able to write a number of essays throughout the semester. And at the end of that semester, on the left-hand side, the experimental group went from 67% proficient to 95% proficient. Essentially, everyone was writing at a proficient level now because they had had so much feedback and so much practice writing. in the control group where the students were not able to write as much and did not get as much good feedback, they remained at about 70% proficient. Essentially, they made no progress. So there's a huge difference here. And so this is a system where there's no consequences. This is not about grades. This is about learning. This is the formative assessment feedback that Rose was speaking about earlier today. And so there's no consequences if the machine might make a mistake or give a wrong score or give scores that are not perfectly reliable, because there's so much more benefit to using this machine-generated scoring system, and it frees up the teachers to do the things that are most important to them. Let's go to the next slide. So here's an example of how we use automated scoring. And in my example of Right to Learn, it's very clear that automated scoring is a really good way to do that, because the students learn more, the teachers don't have to give as much feedback, and they can spend their time and energy doing things that they are very good at. Now, we also use this kind of same sort of system for speaking. We have a number of automated speaking tests within Pearson that all use systems that generate automatically generated scores within minutes. And then people can also use them for this same sort of feedback. Now, in some cases, the stakes or the consequences of scoring might be higher. People are using these tests in order to recruit people for sitting in jobs, for training and leadership programs, for promotion, immigration. All of these purposes are there. So what we need to do as a company is make sure that we develop the best automatic scoring system that we can, that is defensible for all of these purposes, even the purposes that are higher stakes. In some cases, you might think it's too high stakes. I am not going to let someone into my country on the basis of points that they got from an automatically scored test. Well, that would be a judgment call you can make. The comparison is the Right to Learn system, where it's really clear that the automated scoring provides many benefits and very few disadvantages. So we always have to kind of weigh the trade-offs between the advantages and disadvantages of automated scoring. What we strive to do in Pearson is work so hard on the reliability and the validity of our systems so that we can guarantee that the automated speaking tests or the automated writing tests that we give can actually be used to make important judgments and decisions about people's lives. So I will stop there, and we can open this up for questions from you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Bill. Thank you, Rose. We've got a lot of questions, and I'm going to try and get through as many as we can. I'd ask you to kind of keep your answers to 60 to 90 seconds. I'm going to start. The first one I'm going to start with is for Rose. And one of the questions that came in from the audience was about reliability, specifically about writing and speaking. And the concern being that sometimes the reliability of those traits is the harder to measure because, and therefore less reliable, because the topics and questions are less familiar for students. Is that a fair way to think about it?
Well, I think, you know, if you think about the demand of an assessment, whatever that assessment is, the assessment has to be targeted at the correct sort of level of demand. So if you're trying to write an assessment or create assessment for a student of, let's say, lower ability, then you would make sure that the context that you're asking are very personal to them. They're very accessible at that level. And then as we know, things get slightly more abstract as you go up the sort of demand level. The thing you have to remember about these systems that we're talking about is that one of the strengths of them is that they're not random. We're not sort of putting items in and not knowing how they're going to perform. The beauty of these systems is that we can pre-test items, we can trial items, we can try them out on a whole range of people so we know that they're targeted correctly. But the answer to your question is essentially about targeting effectively, depending on the targeting of the assessments, the purpose of the assessment, so that you want assessments to differentiate. You do not want everybody to get top marks. You want to know where the strengths and weaknesses lie. So we would target an assessment to have a range of sort of type of tasks, of type of question types, so that we can start to see where people's strengths and weaknesses are, and as Bill said, actually indicate to them what they need to do to progress.
Thanks, Rose. Bill, a question for you, and it's about the AI engine itself, right? There's a belief that the AI engine is quite rudimentary, and whether it's just syntax or semantics, or is it much more sophisticated than that and is able to much more deeply and holistically assess student performance? Can you talk a little bit about how engine training works and how sophisticated the AI engine is for writing and speaking assessments?
Sure, I can, let's give an example from writing, for example. So if we ask someone with a prompt to write an essay, and we're asking them to react to a certain topic, like, should young children be using cell phones? And so you're going to develop your ideas and submit those ideas in the form of an essay. Now, how would we develop an automated scoring system for this kind of prompt? What we would do is collect a lot of data from people of many different levels of writing proficiency, and then we would subject those, first of all, to some kind of analysis where we can understand the meaning of what they wrote. And so we have systems that, just like Google and Siri and all these other systems, kind of understand what you're asking for when you talk into your phone, or when you tell Google, I'm looking for a doctor who can help me with my foot problem or something. It doesn't depend on those exact words. It abstracts to the meaning of what you meant. So our system can also do that. After we collect, say, 500 essays of people who have written on this topic, we can ask human raters to give ratings. In many cases, we'll get multiple ratings using a scoring rubric like what I've already shown you. And we would get some kind of like gold standard of what each essay really deserves based on the scoring rubric or the criteria that have been put into that rubric. Now we use machine learning techniques, and we tell the computer, all right, here's find an algorithm, find a way of judging the content of these that best matches the human ratings that were given. So that's kind of in the development section. Now we're going to test out that system by giving it some new responses that it has never seen before. And we'll see how well does it match other human ratings based on the machine scores. So the machine has never seen that response before. Some human ratings were given to it, but the machine never had access to them. And we want to see how well they match. So that's kind of the validity or the testing of our system. So we develop our systems with a lot of data up front. And then once we test out that system and verify that it's working correctly, the system gives a score which is correlated very, very highly, in many cases 0.98, with the same kind of score that humans would have given. And it's doing this, again, using abstract concepts and meaning rather than just the particular words or grammar or the general language that was used. So that's the way that we would score some of these kinds of traits.
Thank you, Bill. And just to follow up to that, can you talk a little bit about, I guess it's a multifaceted question. Can you just talk a little bit about how does the technology used for PTE, as an example, differ from like a Google speech input or Siri that we just talked about? And then how does it account for different various accents and that are prevalent around the world, and ensure that you have consistency in the scores provided, regardless of the English accent used?
Sure. Okay. So much of what we're doing is the same as what Google or Apple Siri do, which is to take speech and then use a machine transcription to recognize that speech as the words that are most likely the ones that were spoken. And this requires a huge amount of artificial intelligence because speech is very complex, and often the words that we use are not very predictable between one and another. So the first step is really to just transform that speech into text in the computer. And then that's when Pearson's particular advantages or expertise come into play, because now we're not just understanding what was said, but we're giving a judgment about it. We're saying, how can we compare that person's speech to other people's speech and understand how is their fluency in English? Is it kind of low? Is it medium? Or is it high? In that case, we have another data set with a lot of data that we've collected that's based on some human ratings of fluency, and then using machine analysis tools where they separate out the words and understand the sounds and the spaces in between the sounds, the number of hesitations, the locations of those hesitations in your speech, we can quantify the fluency that you had in that response, and we can guarantee that it can be produced in a similar way over and over again. So that's kind of the scoring mechanism, is speech and then scoring. Now, accents is another kind of problem because the input, as you know, if you use Siri or some of these other systems, can be quite variable. We tune our system in PTE Academic to be based on foreign language speech. So we train it on many accents from many different places. Many of the places where you are from are giving us the original data where we train the engine on these accents and ways of speaking, so that it recognizing a word like rater does not depend on a perfect pronunciation of rater. There is going to be a lot of variability. Even people that come from English-speaking countries pronounce the word rater in quite different ways. So the system has to be flexible and recognize that there are many ways to pronounce all of these words, and it arrives at the most statistically likely kind of transcription that someone used. So we train it on a lot of different accents, both people from countries where English is not a lingua franca or a native language, and many other places where people do use English as a lingua franca or a native language. So we do have a bit of an advantage over Apple and Google in that sense, because we are focused on accented speech primarily, and they tend to be focused more on speech which is of a standard variety. And if you know, so for example, if I speak Spanish, but if I turn my phone on and try to speak Spanish to it, sometimes it doesn't recognize my speech very well because I don't have a perfect Spanish accent. And we try to get around that scoring system by developing it with a lot of data and many different accents.
I think if, just to add to that, I think, and I noticed in the chat, people were asking in particular about, well, what do we mean by AI and all that sort of stuff. It is a very generic term. In itself, it means very little. And I would say the simple answer, which Bill has sort of gone into a little bit more detail about, is that it's only as good, an AI system is only as good as it's been trained to do. It'll replicate the way it's been trained. And so you don't set up our sort of system lightly. We have spent sort of, 15, 20 years plus developing these systems and making sure that they're representative of the people that take them. Technology, I think, will get quicker as we go forward. It might become less burdensome to set these systems up, but right now, if you're looking to AI systems, you do need to look at sort of areas that have comprehensive testing and trialing and research and development to back up their data.
Awesome, thank you, Rose. Rose, a question for you. Can you talk a little bit about where in the learning journey, should teachers provide assessment feedback, especially the formative kind that kind of you referenced as part of your presentation?
Well, I mean, the thing is that, I've said it a few times before. I mean, I was a teacher, and you find if you've got 100 teachers in the room, they would all give you 100 different answers to that they would consider the most effective formative approaches. Some people might say that formative assessment was hardly around 20 years ago and wasn't used very much, and it was a very sort of didactic method of teaching. But certainly, most teacher training courses now try and sort of enable teachers to try loads of different ways of using, any sort of formative approaches or formative and diagnostic data. Some people like to do sort of almost like a pre-test, post-test. Some people like to sort of see what people know at the beginning of a session or a module and then test them at the end. Some people like to break down a skill into particular aspects of it and build a skill up from small aspects into a whole aspect. I used to teach science when I was a teacher, and so instead of getting people to do experiments in one big way, because they just didn't know how the component parts fitted together. So what we would do is we'd get them to do a planning sort of series, assess that they were progressing in that, then looking at the methods that they were using, then looking at data collection, then looking at analysis. If you think about the aspects of language that Bill's talked about in terms of writing and reading, you can take a holistic view, or you could take an atomistic view where you're looking at particular things and you want to show improvement in the smaller things, or you can take a more holistic view and give people tasks that are appropriate to their stage of development and combine skills together.
Thanks for that, Rose. Bill, the next question's for you. The question came up about how do you effectively provide feedback, and what does kind of feedback look like from some of these systems? So I asked Jen to put up a version of a score report, so you can kind of talk through a little bit as to how we're able to take the information that we get from our speaking assessments and written assessments and actually translate it into actionable stuff in the classroom. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Sure. I would say at this point, because we are focused on assessment and a lot of the products that we work on in this group are summative kinds of products. Often the feedback that we give is in the form of test scores and score descriptors. As you can see on the Pearson English Placement Test score report here, it gives a score that's an overall score on the GSE of 66. We can see that that's a CEFR level of about a B2, and it gives specific can-do kinds of statements, or a descriptor of what a person at this level typically can do. And we also give it specific to those skills, to reading, writing, listening, and speaking. In some cases, we can even give it at a lower level for things like pronunciation or fluency, for example. We are just kind of at the beginning of doing this in a way that is more formative and less summative. So when we're working on the summative side, we're typically dealing with test scores. When we're on the formative side, often there's no grade or score given. There's often just like some specific feedback about what we saw, about how you might be able to have done it more effectively or better, or to get, to have had a higher score. I think we're just in the beginning of these kinds of systems where we can eventually develop some kind of intelligent tutoring where you could engage in speaking and listening tasks in a very interactive way, and that computer would be like your tutor. When I was learning languages, when I was living abroad, I often had friends or other people that would provide me with really good specific feedback, and they would tell me how they would have said the same thing or what kind of errors I made. They would kind of tell, I could tell them what sort of feedback I wanted, and they could give it to me. They were very patient, they were very friendly, and of course they did it out of love because they weren't being paid. We would like to develop systems that do that same kind of thing, but they never get tired. They don't care if you tried the same task over and over and over again because they would never get bored. And that kind of system eventually could provide a lot of that good feedback, which right now only teachers or tutors can do on a one-on-one basis. So I think that's kind of the dream of where we would like to be able to get. You can see that already in the right to learn method that I talked about a little bit for writing. For speaking and listening, it's more challenging, but we're working on those kinds of systems now.
I think the other thing just to mention on that sort of score as well is that, because so much work goes into the research and development of the systems themselves, we can be quite specific about what we want them to give feedback on that is absolutely linked to the task. I think one of the issues that we as sort of human assessors, teachers have, is sometimes we can be distracted and sort of sometimes start to rate people and value people on things that are not really part of the construct at all. So in writing, for example, when we've done studies on actual physical writing abilities, sometimes it's actually the writing style that actually gets assessed more than the writing content. People are distracted sometimes by factors that they shouldn't be considering. Sometimes text length becomes the mark. So as long as somebody's written more words, they're going to get more marks. Whereas the system that Bill was talking about earlier, using latent semantic analysis, there's no word counts in there. There's no sort of like, if you write something more, you're going to get more marks. It's looking at the quality and the meaning of what you're writing. So we can, by training these systems very specifically, they don't sort of go and wander off and actually maybe start considering things that they shouldn't be.
Thank you, Rose. So I've got one final question for each of you. So Bill, the question I'm going to ask you is based on test security. We're getting a lot of questions about how do you manage test security? How do you ensure that the data you're getting or the performance you're getting is actually the right student? And how do you prevent cheating? Can you talk a little bit about what capabilities you use to prevent cheating on the front end and potentially even on the back end to withhold scores and ensure that the scores being produced are for the right learner?
Well, I guess it depends what you consider cheating. Certainly for the higher stakes tests that we have, like PTE Academic, you have to take the test in a secure test center. We have a lot of physical security and identification checking that happens. So there are a lot of systems built in to make sure that you are the person actually taking the test, and that you're taking the test in a controlled environment so that you can't be using any external help. And we do our best. And of course, this is always, as we say in English, a cat and mouse game. The cat becomes faster, and then the mouse becomes faster, and then the cat continue to chase the mouse. So we're always trying to learn about what kind of cheating might be going on and trying to figure out systems to detect that. Other aspects of security might be the fact that some people might try to memorize items or test questions through systems that collect them and then sell them to you, or you might have a training system that tells you that they're going to train you how to answer these questions. So we have to understand what it is that they're doing and try to detect that. In some cases, people might, for example, not give a spoken answer that is on the topic based on the prompt. They don't talk about that question about whether kids should have cell phones. They memorize something which they can say very quickly and easily and with a good accent because it's memorized, and they give that answer. So our system has to be able to detect when people do those sorts of things and give them an appropriate score of 0 because they didn't address the question. For the security of the items, we have many items that we are constantly refreshing the item bank with. We are doing an evaluation of the questions so that we can figure out if scores are going up and up and up. For one particular question, it may be that it was compromised, that question was put on a website somewhere and other people have been consulting it. So we can remove that question from the pool so that the scores will continually have the same meaning, that a score of 73 always means that they have a level of 73, not that they were practicing the test or learning those items. Ideally, summative tests, like many of the ones that we've been talking about today, are not tests that you can practice for very effectively. You can practice the skills of learning English better, of learning to understand it better, but you should really get no benefit from going to a practice school and memorizing items or learning test-taking skills from a teacher. We should be able to make our tests completely not vulnerable to that kind of practice effect, because what we want to see is that people with higher proficiency get higher scores, not people that have the money and the time to engage in test practice activities getting higher scores. So that's part of our job as a testing company.
Thank you, Bill. And Rose, the question is for you. From the perspective of a teacher, if the assessments that we're providing give lots of great feedback to the student, what is the role of the teacher going forward, right? How does the role of the teacher change? And are we minimizing it at all? Or are there other benefits that we're perhaps not seeing on the face of it?
Nick, what can I say? If I really wish I was a teacher that had access to those technologies 20 years ago, because I would have been first in the queue. When I took my bag home from work and had a whole load of homework to do, if I'd have had technology to help me, I would have absolutely jumped at it. I think what we all know that the people that we that we value in terms of educating our children, our teachers with the skills that they have. We want to make sure that those skills are channeled, and those sort of that training and that dedication is channeled to where it is the most needed, which is about sort of the interaction between the teacher and the student, and actually using sometimes information that students find quite difficult to absorb, to actually then interpret of how to progress. You know, engagement, motivation, enjoyment, all those things in terms of the subject matter. Teachers are the best at doing those things. What we want to do is to free up the available time that they have for both classes and individuals, so that those valuable skills that they have are the most employed in terms of the interaction between them and students, rather than poring over sort of, you know, homework books all the time. They can be selective. They might want to assess once every 5 times, once every 10 times, but still know that they're able to use data that is available elsewhere.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. It's been an hour, believe it or not, and it has gone by really quickly. And I've got so many more questions I'd love to ask, but I know people have other commitments. But thank you everyone for joining. We had hundreds of participants, really awesome. This is really the start of our summer, right? This is the start of our assessment summer camp, like we call it. The next webinar is coming up on the 21st of July, powering up soft skills. So hopefully you will join us for that. And we have close to a dozen webinars over the next month. So please register, and hopefully you will have great participation and you feel like you're making the most of your summer. Stay safe and enjoy your summer or winter, wherever you are in the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.